response strategies. In this concept video, we're going to go over the 4 response strategies, and then we'll do a quick exam prep and reflection question. All right, so let's talk about a few listening response strategies of effective communicators. So first, there's a nonverbal component, and this is just the signals and illustrations that we give to people to show that we're listening and understanding. So that's going to have like the actual nonverbal component, which is like head nods, smiling, or furrowing our eyebrows, or matching their facial expression, maybe positioning our body so we're facing them, showing we're listening. But there's also kind of a verbal component where, you might say things like, right. It's kind of like in the nonverbal chapter when we heard, like, where we learned about vocalized pauses. This is kind of the same thing. So even though it's a verbal component, it's still kind of a nonverbal because you're not really communicating a message per se as far as what the words are saying. But what you're really doing is you're communicating like, oh, I want to keep hearing you, keep talking. All right, then you have emotional support. So support strategies create an environment that encourages the other person to talk about and make sense of a distressing situation. So I can't remember if we've talked about this already, or if we're going to talk about it if we haven't. But this is basically what we call like communication environment, or communication climate, communication climate. And this is kind of the climate of how someone feels when they're talking to you. Are you rushing them? It's kind of like when you think back about the different styles of listening. Are you nodding, trying to get them to hurry up? Are you being a time-oriented listener? Or are you slowing down and saying, okay, I'll be a people-oriented listener, especially if this is something where you're needing support. So sometimes it's appropriate to, obviously, that our response needs to be just to reassure, encourage, soothe, console, and cheer up. Something that I think is the best thing that we can do for people is right away, maybe ask that clarifying question, like, okay, you're telling me about this just before we get started. Are you wanting advice, or do you just want me to listen? That's a good way to know, okay, do I need to go into like the listening response strategy of just emotional support, being there, not necessarily trying to correct or fix, just providing support for someone. What this doesn't mean is that we make up false statements, or we say things that are untruthful, or like, oh, you're so right. Like, say they're telling you about a situation and you're going on about how they're so right, when really maybe they aren't the right person in that situation. That's not helping, and that's not being supportive. You want to always say truthful statements no matter what, but you can still support and be emotionally supportive of another person. Next, we have constructive criticism. So this has to do with like actual like listening to someone constructively criticize you. And some people don't like this. I actually, in some formats, I really like constructive criticism if it's done well. But anytime that we're doing this, or we're hearing it, or we're hearing somebody, then we want to give this like constructive criticism back, we want to make sure that we do a few things. So when we can't agree with a speaker in what they're saying, it's best if we kind of come up with a response that demonstrates respect, even if we are criticizing what they are saying. So I know that we don't like the word criticize. It sounds mean, but it's really not. It's really just saying, okay, we may disagree, but here's respectfully, here's what I think. And so the best way to do that is to follow these guidelines, which is use I statements. I'm not saying you, but saying I feel that this is. Anytime that you say I, it takes a level of that, like someone feeling defensive off of it, because you're not saying it's them or speaking for them. You're just speaking your own truth. So use I language, use specific language and examples. So vagueness is one of the worst things to do whenever you're providing any type of constructive criticism, even if it's like a friend who you're trying to say, like, maybe you're not the right person in the situation. Being vague or beating around the bush, not using direct communication isn't great. But remember, direct communication does not mean being rude or being hurtful at all. You want to still be thoughtful about what you're saying, but one of the best things you can do is be specific about the language and examples that you use. And then finally, find something positive before your critique. A lot of times I'll say something that's positive about what they're saying, something I understood. Remember, we learned earlier, you can understand without thinking someone's right or changing your opinion, but you can understand them. So one of the things that I try to do is I might say something about what they said. I'll mention that and say, I can totally understand blank. And let them know, I get that. I understand why you think that. and then I'll switch it to, from my perspective, I see things, and I think that softens that blow to say, look, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying like absolutely, and I'm not trying to fight with you. I'm saying, I see it. I get where you're coming from. This is my perspective. And then that makes them more willing to hear you out, right? Okay, and then last we have speech critique. And this is like for formal speech critiques. So we'll do a speech critique in a couple of weeks, but this is basically, if you're ever in a situation where you're having to give some kind of critique to someone, like for me, I do, like I've told y'all before, I do lots of interviews here at UAPTC. So I try to, I think a lot about that. We have to write our feedback on those forms. So I'm always even though the person's probably not ever going to see that, I'm still very respectful. I'm honest. I give helpful feedback. I'm not ever sure if they see it or not. So I always try to give some feedback in case they do. But if they say it's somebody giving a speech, or somebody's asking you to help them with a presentation, or in business, you may need to, like if you're working with a group on a project, you may have to give some critiques, or like I do a yearly evaluation with my boss. That's another area of critique. So in those situations, these formal situations, we want to focus on these 4 things. So one, like I said, you want to use all the things that you do in constructive criticism. Like you want to make sure to still use the I language, be specific, and then say something positive. But whenever you do finally get to the criticism part or the critique part, then you want to first make sure that it's respectful, honest, helpful. But then you want to look at content. So you want to look at these 4 things. You want to comment on content. So that means focus on the purpose of the speech or the situation, if it's a project, whatever it is, the formal situation. So you want to focus on the purpose. Did they meet that purpose? And then 2, you want to focus on structure. This focuses on the introduction and the organization of maybe the project or the presentation, or or if it's a speech, the speech in general. Then you want to think about delivery. And this is talking about the focus on like voice and use of body. And then finally, visual aid. So the visual construction that they've used, you'll do a visual aid for your next speech. And so that's something that like I'll be commenting on and helping you with. But these are the 4 things, the 4 strategies that we can do. And it kind of goes from like interpersonal to the more formal situations across the board. So, if we can accurately apply all of these, we will become really good listeners, active listeners, but we'll also be really good communicators about the information that we have taken in. Time for some more exam prep questions. Make sure to pause the video, answer your questions, and write down the why behind your answers. Now for your reflection question. Which of the listening response strategies is easiest and hardest for you to implement in interpersonal conversations?